Hello everybody, this is Dratnos here with a video about my ideal Mythic Plus expansion. Mythic Plus is one of my favorite parts of the game, though it's by no means the only thing I enjoy, and it's always tricky for the game designers to prioritize how to spend their time across all the different systems in the game. But for the purposes of this video, I'm going to completely ignore those very real concerns and just talk about the best Mythic Plus expansion I could imagine in a perfect world. At its core, there are several fundamental parts of the game that need to be well designed for Mythic Plus to be fun. The first is that specs need to be fun, and ideally relatively balanced. In BFA and Legion, this hasn't always been great in Mythic Plus. There have been these long stretches where specs like Blood Death Knight, then Outlaw Rogue, and Resto Druid, they've all been dominant, and at different times they've bought the best damage, survivability, and utility for their role, and in some cases that has survived unchanged for many patches. A large part of this is because it's hard to keep the specs balanced in Raid and PvP, as well as Mythic Plus at the same time, but again, that's not something we'll focus on too much in this video since this is a wishlist. Some specs have also never really shined in Mythic Plus. Some healers like Shaman just don't scale all that well down to 5-player content, while some DPS like Moonkin this season just don't scale up all that well into AoE situations, which are at the core of Mythic Plus. In my perfect expansion, these issues would be a very high priority, and I'd love to see frequent balance changes, especially aimed to help those lower represented specs. The next thing that is vitally important is dungeon design itself. In fact, this informs which characteristics of specs are going to be valuable and need to be balanced around. Legion dungeons, for instance, got fairly one-shotty at high key levels, and so specs that survived those large hits were valuable. But that wasn't really a thing in BFA, where stuff like a short interrupt cooldown and many ways to interact with individual enemies in a pack became more valuable. Back in Legion, you would also often be able to pull 20 enemies at once, hit them with some AoE crowd control effects, and then kite. BFA upended this philosophy with a multi-pronged approach. They reduced tank threat, increased the amount of important interrupts, and reduced the amount of time that we could keep enemies neutralized with AoE stuns, and removed the old Arcane Torrent, which was another huge thing that kept enemies locked down in an AoE fashion. They also added several anti-kite mechanics, such as Fervent Strike and Rending Maul from the two different kinds of Honor Guard in Ataldazar. These are abilities which are normally cast on the tank, but will instead murder random group members if the tank is out of range and kiting. In general, I think it's good that enemies have important abilities, and that larger pulls aren't commonly doable. Although I do think that a little bit of big AoE can be a very fun moment in a dungeon. I think that the anti-kite mechanics in general are a little too widespread in BFA, and they can often feel pretty harsh and unfun when they kill you. So I'd probably try removing those, since I think that the other changes fix the problem that they're trying to solve. Affixes are another huge design choice that affects how fun Mythic Plus can be. For me, there are a few affixes that are just exhausting when they're active, bolstering and explosive chief among them. These are affixes that, difficulty aside, they just make it very easy to get burned out from Mythic Plus due to how punishing they can be, often with little counterplay, and how you have to think about them on every single pull of the dungeon. Infested and Beguiling fell into this category for me as well, and I think that it's especially important for the seasonal affix to not be like this, since it's active every single week. If I were in charge, I'd nerf several of the affixes, because I feel like weeks when the affixes are easier are some of the more fun Mythic Plus weeks, because then we can do the keys at a higher level, and the mob abilities themselves and the boss abilities themselves become more challenging and interesting. Here are some of the changes I'd make. I'd make Bolstering have a 20-second duration, which would refresh if a new stack was applied. I'd make Explosives spawn far less often than they currently do in large pulls, and maybe spawn slightly more often on single target. I'd also make them behave like totems do in PvP, where instead of having a health total, they just die to 1 or maybe 2 direct abilities. I'd also nerf Grievous slightly, so that additional stacks only get applied below certain health thresholds, like 70% for the second stack, 50% for the third stack, and 30% for the fourth stack. Teaming I'd change so it never adds any particularly brutal enemies, like extra commanders in Siege, extra witches in Waycrest, or extra dervishes in Temple. I'd also take a long look at Fortified and Tyrannical and probably replace them entirely, since the overwhelming majority of Mythic Plus seasons from the beginning of Legion have had either one or the other be far easier for pushing keys. At the time of recording this, it's Fortified that's easier, with the top Tyrannical run below more than 500 Fortified runs on the leaderboards. The idea I'd start with is replacing Fortified with Reaping, a great seasonal affix that never got old, although that would require Blizzard to re-examine their target capping philosophy, as that season was not fun for specs that were target capped to 5 targets, like Fury and Marksmanship, and there are many more specs that are getting that treatment on the Shadowlands Alpha. I'd then look into reworking Tyrannical into an affix that empowers certain boss abilities rather than giving the bosses more health and damage. So maybe an ability that's normally a boss frontal now comes with a vortex that attempts to suck everyone into harm's way first. The seasonal affix is something that I think can be great. Reaping and Awakened were both very fun, and I'd love to see them continue with the Awakened design in this slot, where the affix offers you a challenge, but then rewards you for completing it. Awakened gives you skips and mobility around the dungeon, but you could easily have affixes that grant you other benefits, like obviously damage or stat buffs, but you could even come up with other rewards. For example, what if killing a mini-boss or completing whatever sort of seasonal affix objective, what if doing that gave you an on-use, one-time extra action button that stunned up to 5 enemies for 10 seconds and made them take extra damage? Think about how many awesome options you'd have for how to make great use of that in a dungeon. What about one that let you permanently mind control an enemy mob? Or one that let you mark an enemy and then all damage dealt to that enemy would also be replicated to some number of nearby enemies? The possibilities for design in this space feel endless to me, and I really would like them to go in this direction because when you have that kind of reward for completing a challenge, you not only get the cool question of how do we best complete this challenge, but you also get the cool question of what are we supposed to do with this reward, Where are we supposed to drop this Awakened portal for maximum benefit? How do we move through this dungeon with that? Or where would we use this other kind of reward, one of the ones I just mentioned, for maximum efficiency in a dungeon? Finally, let's talk a little bit about rewards. Let me start by saying that I don't think the best gear in the game should necessarily be available from Mythic Plus, but in a perfect world, I do think that players should be able to choose to be entirely focused on Mythic Plus and shouldn't feel way behind for not raiding or not doing PvP. By the way, I also think this should be true for people who only want to raid or who only want to PvP. Designing that gear system is very hard, but it would be a priority of mine. I'd also want cosmetic rewards associated with Mythic Plus success, like mounts, titles, and transmog. Right now, Mythic Plus has finally gotten a little of that, with one title and one mount associated with timing all the 15s and all the 10s. But I'd love to see the support increase to the level of PvP, where there are several titles, mounts, and transmog sets available per season. I'd also like there to be in-game leaderboards with perhaps some incentives, like the challenge mode teleports, for climbing to the very top of the ladder. These are just a few of the things that I'd do if I was in charge of making a Mythic Plus expansion. Thanks for watching this video, and I'd love to hear your ideas in the comments below. Remember to like this video if you enjoyed it, and be sure to hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one. If you want to hear more from me, I'm Dratnos, both on YouTube and on Twitch. I hope you've enjoyed this video I've made for Method. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.